The year was 1887, and the wind howling across the Wyoming plains didn't just blow. It bit. It carried the dry, ancient scent of sagebrush and the grit of a land that fought back against anyone trying to tame it. In the middle of this vast emptiness sat Redemption Creek, a town that looked less like a settlement and more like a scar on the earth. A single rutted dirt road served as the town's spine, connecting the only three things that seemed to matter out here: the general store, the auction house, and the saloon. It was a hard place for hard men, and even more desperate women. Jacob Harlo stood on the weathered porch of the Silver Dollar Saloon, leaning back against the railing with a glass of whiskey resting easily in his hand. At 35, Jacob was the king of this dust bowl. He owned the Double H Ranch, a spread of land so massive it seemed to swallow the horizon. His face was etched with the lines of a man who had spent his life battling droughts, blizzards, and thieves, and he had won. Every single time. He had eyes the color of storm clouds, and they didn't miss a thing. When Jacob walked down the street, men straightened their backs and tipped their hats. Women watched him too, but from a safe distance. There was an edge to Jacob Harlo, a quiet danger that no amount of money or fine tailoring could hide. Auctions. "Startin' soon," Tom Brennan muttered, stepping up beside him. Tom was Jacob's foreman, and the only man in the territory Jacob truly considered a friend. Jacob didn't respond immediately. He took a slow sip of his drink. These autumn auctions had become a grim tradition in Redemption Creek. It was a marketplace for the abandoned widows left with nothing, women with no family standing on a block to be bid on in exchange for a roof over their heads and food on their tables. It was a practical solution for a brutal world, but it always left a sour taste in Jacob's mouth. He believed in survival, but he hated the spectacle of it. "Who's on the block?" Jacob finally asked, his voice low. "Don't know much," Tom replied, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust below. "But word is, there's a new one. Came in on the stagecoach yesterday, wrapped up tight in black mourning gear like a shadow. Folks are calling her the Mystery Widow. Ain't nobody seen her face yet." Inside the saloon, the noise was rising. Men were already laughing, placing side bets on which woman they'd take home, turning someone else's tragedy into their afternoon sport. Jacob's jaw tightened. He had no intention of participating. He didn't need a wife, and he certainly didn't need the trouble that came with one. His ranch ran like clockwork, and his life was exactly how he liked it, uncomplicated. But the phrase "mystery widow" stuck in his mind, nagging at him. Across the street, Judge Samuel Morrison was already climbing onto his makeshift podium. The judge was the town's auctioneer, magistrate, and loudest moralizer, all rolled into one. "Gather round, gentlemen," Morrison bellowed, his voice booming. "We have 5 fine ladies today looking for good Christian homes." The street flooded with people. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, and cheap liquor. Jacob remained on the porch, arms crossed over his chest, watching dispassionately as the first few women were led out. He recognized most of them: Sarah Meals, Betty Donovan, young Annie Peterson. They were just regular women dealt a bad hand by a harsh frontier. But then she stepped out. The crowd's murmur died instantly. The mystery widow moved onto the platform, draped in a heavy black cloak that swallowed her figure entirely. A thick veil obscured her face, rendering her featureless. Black gloves, black dress, black shoes. While the other women shifted their weight and looked at their feet, this woman stood perfectly rigid. She held her head high, projecting a strange, silent pride. For a heartbeat, the rowdy men were silenced, unsettled by a woman who hid everything yet somehow commanded the entire street's attention. Judge Morrison cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Now, gentlemen, this lady values her privacy. She is educated, can read and write, and is skilled in domestic arts. Her name will be revealed only when arrangements are concluded. The spell broke, and the whispers started, turning nasty. What's she hiding under there? Someone shouted from the back. Probably diseased. Another jeered. Or ugly as sin. A third voice laughed. Jacob felt a flare of irritation. It wasn't pity. He didn't do pity, but it was a deep disdain for the cruelty of the mob. Compelled by something he couldn't name, he set his glass down and walked off the porch, shouldering his way through the pack of bodies until he stood right near the front. Up close, the woman looked like a statue carved from midnight. She didn't flinch at the insults. But Jacob, with his hunter's eyes, noticed the one thing she couldn't control. Her gloved hands, hanging by her sides, were trembling. A tiny rhythmic twitch. She was terrified, but she was fighting with everything she had not to show it. Let's open the bidding at $20. The judge cried out. Silence. 10, still nothing. The judge's confident smile began to slip. Jacob didn't look away from the veiled figure. He could practically feel the fear radiating off her, hidden behind that wall of black fabric. Suddenly, a slur of words broke the tension from behind him. Well, looky here, Harlo. Jacob didn't have to turn to know who it was. Buck Watson, a rancher, with too much money, too much liquor in his belly, and not enough sense to fill a thimble. Buck stumbled out of the saloon, grinning like a predator who just spotted a wounded deer. I got a proposition for you, Jacob, Buck drawled, swaying slightly as the crowd turned to watch the showdown. Jacob remained silent, staring the drunk rancher down, but the crowd's attention had already shifted, hungry for drama. Buck slapped a thick wad of bills against his open palm, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet. I'll bet you $100. Right now that you can't get that crow to shed those feathers. Buck sneered, gesturing loosely toward the woman on the platform. Hell, let's make it interesting. 200 says you can't get her into your bed by sunrise. A ripple of laughter exploded through the mob. On the platform, the woman in black stiffened visibly, her posture tightening as if she were bracing for a physical blow. You're drunk, Watson, Jacob said, his voice flat and unimpressed. Maybe I am, Buck grinned, his teeth yellowed and crooked. But my money's just fine. Unless the great Jacob Harlo is scared. Maybe you're losing your touch with the ladies, old man. Jacob felt his pride flare up like dry grass, catching a spark. The rational part of his brain told him to walk away, to get back on his horse and leave this circus behind. But the crowd was watching, waiting to see if the king of the territory would back down, and more importantly, she was watching. Even through that heavy veil, he could feel her gaze on him. Make it 300, Jacob heard himself say before he could stop the words. And you've got a bet. Buck's smirk twisted into a satisfied, wolfish sneer. Done. Judge Morrison, sensing a massive payday, slammed his gavel down with renewed energy. We have an opening bid. Mr. Harlo offers 50. 75, Jacob corrected, his voice low but cutting through the air like a knife. And that is my final offer. The judge didn't wait for a counterbid. He knew better. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed off the wooden storefronts. Sold to Mr. Jacob Harlo. The crowd roared, a mix of cheers and jeers. As the noise began to settle, Jacob stepped forward toward the platform. The woman hadn't moved an inch. She seemed frozen, carved from stone and shadow. Ma'am, he said quietly, reaching up to offer her his hand. For a long, agonizing moment, she didn't react. Then slowly she reached out. When she placed her gloved hand in his, Jacob was surprised. Her touch was incredibly light, and despite her stoic posture, her hand was trembling violently. She was alive, and she was terrified. My name is Clara, she whispered, the sound barely making it through the thick layers of her veil. Clara Thornton. Jacob helped her down from the wooden stage and guided her through the parting crowd toward his wagon. Laughter and crude jokes followed them, echoing off the buildings. But Jacob kept his eyes forward, ignoring it all. As they steered the wagon out of Redemption Creek, the sun began to dip below the horizon, bleeding a deep, bruised red across the sky. Jacob kept his hands tight on the leather reins, focusing on the road. The silence in the wagon was heavy. He could feel her presence beside him, silent, composed, but hiding a storm of emotion behind that black curtain. He told himself it was just a wager, just a moment of pride. But deep down, a sinking feeling in his gut told him he had just stepped into something far more dangerous than any card, game, or cattle drive. As the last sounds of the town faded behind them, carried away by the wind, Jacob Harlo wondered if he had just purchased his salvation or his damnation. The wagon wheels groaned and creaked over the rutted dirt road as Jacob guided the horses through the fading twilight. The prairie stretched out endlessly around them, glowing a soft orange under the dying light. Clara Thornton sat perfectly still, a dark silhouette against the vast open space. He wanted to say something, to ask why a woman like her would end up selling herself on an auction block, but every question that came to mind felt intrusive and wrong. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of hooves and the wind in the grass. "You don't have to be afraid," he finally said, breaking the silence. "I'm not afraid," she answered softly. Her voice was incredibly calm, but it held a strange weight, as if she had run out of fear years ago and replaced it with something colder, something harder. "I just don't know what comes next." Jacob didn't have an answer for that. He had won her on a bet, and that ugly truth sat heavy on his chest. By the time the Double H ranch came into view, dusk had settled deep over the land. The main house stood tall and square, a beacon of civilization in the wild, with its porch light glowing faintly in the gathering dark. Beyond the house, corrals spread out like a skeleton, and further still, the prairie ran on forever. He brought the wagon to a halt and helped her down. "Welcome to the Double H, Mrs. Thornton. I'd rather you call me Clara," she said quietly. "All right. Clara." The name felt strange on his tongue, too personal, too intimate for a stranger. Maria, his longtime housekeeper, appeared at the front door, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes went wide when she saw the veiled figure standing next. "To her employer, Senator Harlo?" she asked, confused. "Maria, this is Mrs. Thornton," Jacob said, his voice leaving no room for questions. "She be staying here. Please prepare the blue room." Maria hesitated. The blue room was the finest suite in the house, usually reserved for important business partners or visiting family. But she caught the look in Jacob's eye and nodded quickly. "Si, Senator." Clara inclined her head slightly. "Thank you." Jacob watched as she followed Maria inside. Her posture remained straight and proud, every movement possessing a natural grace. Yet, as she reached for the stair railing, he saw her hand shake again. He didn't follow them in. Instead, he turned and headed for the barn, needing the quiet, earthy smell of hay and horses to clear his head. The bet with Buck Watson was gnawing at him. It was pride that had driven him to make that bid, not desire. But the memory of her stillness on that platform, her quiet dignity in the face of such mockery, haunted him. He stayed in the barn until the moon was high, dreading the moment he had to go back inside. When Jacob finally gathered the nerve to leave the barn and enter the main house, he found Maria waiting for him in the warm glow of the kitchen. She wasn't bustling about as usual. Instead, she stood near the stove, her expression troubled. "She is up in her room," Maria said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But she is sitting in the dark. Senator, she seems so ... heavy with sadness. Why does she hide her face like that? Is it shame?" Jacob sighed, scrubbing a hand over his weather-beaten face. He felt tired, a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with ranch work. It was a fire, Maria. She lost everything. Her husband, her child, all of it burned. Maria crossed herself, murmuring a quick prayer in Spanish. Madre de Dios. Poor soul. She paused, her eyes darkening with memory. My cousin. She suffered. Burns when we were young. After that, she covered all the mirrors. She never let the sun touch her skin again. The scars, they steal a woman's spirit. The realization hit Jacob like a physical blow. Scars, of course. It wasn't just grief or modesty keeping that veil in place. It was damage. That explained the heavy gloves, the high collar, the way she moved with a protective stiffness, as if shielding herself from the world's gaze. He poured himself a glass of whiskey in the study, but found he couldn't bring himself to drink it. The house was quiet, yet it felt different, alive. Above him, the floorboards creaked rhythmically. Back and forth, she was pacing. There was a restlessness in those footsteps that matched the turmoil in his own gut. Hours passed. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight. Jacob was staring into the dying embers of the fireplace when a soft knock sounded at the door. Jacob set his glass down, bracing himself. Come in. The heavy oak door swung open slowly. Clara stood in the threshold. She had removed the thick traveling cloak, but she was still dressed entirely in black. The veil was still there, a dark barrier catching the flickering lamplight, outlining the faint shape of her face beneath it. I apologize for the intrusion, she said. Her voice was steady, composed, but there was a tightness to it. But I thought it best we settle this matter tonight. Jacob stood up, feeling a sudden surge of unease. Mrs. Thornton. Clara, he corrected himself. You should be resting. It's been a long day. Please, she interrupted gently, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind her. Let me speak before I lose my nerve. Jacob went still, waiting. I heard them, she said, her veiled face turning toward him. In town, I heard the laughter. You made a wager, didn't you? A bet that you could get me to remove my veil before the sun came up. Jacob's stomach twisted. He wanted to deny it, to lie, but he had never been a liar. It was foolish talk, he said, his voice rough with regret. The whiskey and the crowd, ... It was a mistake, Clara. I don't expect you to do anything. I heard the amount too, she continued, ignoring his apology. It was a lot of money. I don't care about the money. But you won, she said simply. Slowly, she raised her gloved hands to her head. You bought the mystery, Mr. Harlo. You have a right to see what you paid for. Clara, stop, Jacob said, stepping forward. You don't have to do this. I do, she replied. Her fingers were shaking, fumbling with the pins that held the silk in place, but her voice remained eerily calm. 14 months ago, my life ended. My husband, Robert, was a newspaper editor, a man of words. He wrote editorials opposing the railroad expansion, calling out the men who were stealing land. She pulled the first layer of the veil away. It drifted to the floor like a shadow. Only a fine mesh remained now. Through it, Jacob could see the ghostly outline of her features, the structure of her jaw, the darkness of her eyes. They didn't like what he wrote, Clara whispered. They sent men to burn us out. I tried to save them. I tried to pull Robert and our son from the flames. Her hands moved again, gripping the final layer of mesh. Jacob held his breath, unable to look away. Lived, she said, her voice cracking for the first time. They didn't. Asterisk with a quick, decisive movement, Clara pulled the final layer of mesh away. It slipped through her fingers and pooled on the floor next to the heavier cloak. Jacob felt the air leave his lungs, but he didn't flinch. He forced himself to look, to really see her. The fire had been cruel. It had claimed the left side of her face, leaving behind a map of pain-shiny, uneven patches of crimson and pale, tight skin that stretched from her temple down to her jawline. The damage didn't stop there. It reached up into her scalp, where the flames had taken her hair, yet the right side of her face remained untouched, a haunting reminder of the woman she had been before the tragedy. Her eye on that side was a striking, clear gray, staring back at him with a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. She wasn't done. With trembling hands, she reached up and unpinned the dark hair on her head. It came away in her hands, a wig. Beneath it, her scalp was mostly bare, save for a few uneven, fragile streaks of brown hair that had managed to grow back amidst the scarring. She stood before him, exposed and vulnerable, the mystery widow, stripped down to her rawest truth. "This is what you bought, Mr. Harlo," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, as if she were describing a broken piece of furniture. "The mystery is solved. You've won your bet. Shall I send for your friend so he can come and verify? So you can collect your winnings?" Jacob's throat felt tight, as if a fist had closed around it. The image of Buck Watson's leering face and the laughing crowd in the saloon suddenly made him feel sick. "No," Jacob rasped. He cleared his throat, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "That's not ... I never wanted this." Clara let out a single, bitter laugh. "It's all right. You don't have to pretend. I'm used to the stares. I'm used to men making jokes, making bets. I am a curiosity to them. A monster. Clara, listen to me," Jacob said, stepping closer. He stopped just a few feet from her, close enough to see the unshed tears shimmering in her gray eye. "You misunderstand. I am not going to collect on that wager. You have every right to your privacy, and I had no right to gamble with it." She looked confused, her guard faltering slightly. "But the money ... I'll pay Watson myself," Jacob said firmly. "I'll find him tomorrow. I'll hand him the $300 and tell him I lost. I'll tell him I couldn't get you to. Take the veil off." The anger drained out of her, replaced by disbelief. "You would lie? You would let the town think you failed? They'll say you've gone soft. They'll laugh at you." "Let them talk," Jacob replied, his voice hardening. "If anyone has anything to say about you, or about me, they can come say it to my face." Clara stared at him, searching his expression for a trick, a hint of mockery. She found none. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you protect the burned widow?" Jacob looked at the scars that mapped her survival. He didn't see a monster. He saw a woman who had walked through hell and kept standing. "Because you have survived. More pain than most men I know could ever endure," Jacob said honestly. "And because ... I'm tired, Clara. I'm tired of being the kind of man who thinks it's acceptable to make bets on another person's suffering." She looked away, her breath catching in a small, ragged gasp. Slowly, she walked over to his armchair and set the wig down on the leather seat. "I should go," she murmured, turning back toward the door. "You can stay," Jacob said quickly. "The blue room is yours, for as long as you need it. You are safe here, Clara. I promise you that." Her lips trembled. "I've forgotten what safe feels like." "Then maybe this is the place where you start remembering." Clara hesitated at the threshold, her hand resting on the brass doorknob. She turned back to look at him one last time, her face fully visible in the lamplight scars and all. "Thank you, Jacob," she said softly, "for seeing me." He nodded. "We all have scars, Clara. Most people just have the luxury of wearing theirs on the inside, where the world can't see them." She slipped out into the hallway, closing the door quietly behind her. Jacob sank into his chair, staring at the wig she had left behind. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, But the house felt different now. He had started the day driven by boredom and arrogance, playing the role of the untouchable rancher. He ended it humbled, shaken to his core by a woman who had lost everything yet possessed more dignity than he had ever known. He poured the whiskey down the sink. The bet was over. But as he listened to the wind, Jacob Harlo realized that for the first time in years, he cared about someone other than himself. And that scared him more than any drought or blizzard ever could. Over the next few weeks, a quiet, unexpected rhythm settled over the Double H Ranch. The woman who had arrived as a silent ghost wrapped in black began to take on a solid, vibrant presence within the house. Clara didn't just hide away in the blue room. She moved through the home with a sense of purpose that Jacob hadn't anticipated. She started with the garden. It had been a patch of dry weeds and dust for years, neglected since Jacob's mother had passed, but Clara spent her mornings on her knees in the dirt, coaxing life out of the hard soil. Inside, she reorganized Maria's chaotic pantry, and soon, the scent of fresh bread and drying herbs replaced the stale air of a bachelor's house. At first, the ranch hands were wary. They walked on eggshells around her, eyes averting whenever she passed. They knew the gossip from town that the boss had bought a burned woman on a drunken bet, and they didn't know how to act. But time and necessity have a way of breaking down barriers. The shift happened on a Tuesday. A young ranch hand named Billy slipped while mending a barbed wire fence, slicing his forearm open deep enough to scare him white, while the other men panicked, unsure of what to do. Clara stepped in. She didn't flinch at the blood. She ordered water and clean linens, her voice calm and commanding. With hands that Jacob had once seen trembling in fear, she cleaned the wound and stitched the skin back together with the precision of a surgeon. "Hold still, Billy," she had said softly. "It's almost done." After that, the men didn't look away anymore. They tipped their hats when they saw her, a genuine respect replacing their earlier unease. Jacob watched all of this from the periphery. He would often stand on the porch with his morning coffee, observing her in the garden. In the harsh light of day, the scars on the left side of her face were visible, jagged and raw against her pale skin. But he noticed that she wasn't hiding them as desperately as before. When she worked, she seemed to forget about the veil, focused entirely on the task at hand. What amazed Jacob wasn't just that she had survived the fire. It was that she was choosing, every single day, to keep living. "She's got a way about her, boss," Tom Brennan said one morning, leaning against the porch rail beside Jacob. "You see that garden? I haven't seen green things grow there in a decade. Now it's fighting to bloom." Jacob smiled faintly, taking a sip of his coffee. "She does seem to have a talent for fixing things." Tom shot him a sideways glance, his eyes crinkling. "Maybe it's time you told her that." Jacob didn't answer. His mind drifted back to the unpleasant business he had handled weeks ago. True. To his word, he had ridden into town the day after the auction. He found Buck Watson at the saloon and slapped $300 onto the bar. He told Buck he'd lost the bet, that he couldn't get the widow to show her face. Buck had laughed, loud and cruel, pocketing the money with a smug grin. "Knew you didn't have it in you, Harlo." He'd crowed. Jacob had turned and walked out without a word. He let Buck have his victory. He let the town gossip that the great Jacob Harlo had gone soft, that he was harboring a woman he couldn't control. Let them talk. The silence at the ranch, the peace Clara had brought, that was worth more than his reputation in a town he despised. Afternoon, Jacob was down at the main corral, tightening the cinch on his saddle, when he heard soft footsteps behind him. "Heading out?" He turned. Clara stood there, shielding her eyes against the afternoon glare. "Going up to the north pasture." Jacob replied, "Need to check the water levels in the wells." It's been too dry lately. He paused, looking at her. You ever ride? A small, wistful smile touched her lips. I grew up on a farm before I met Robert. I haven't been on a horse in years, though. Jacob rested his hand on his horse's neck. Well, the weather's holding. Today's as good a day as any to remember how it's done. Her eyes widened slightly. You want me to come? I could use the company, he said simply. If you're up for it. Clara hesitated for only a second before nodding. I'll need something to wear. Maria was thrilled to help, digging through old trunks to find clothes that would serve. 20 minutes. Later, Clara stepped out onto the porch. She wore a loose work shirt and a split riding skirt that Maria had pinned to fit. On her head sat a wide-brimmed hat, pulled low to shade her face, but she wore no veil dot when she walked toward the horses. Jacob felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the heat. She looked uncertain. Yes, but there was a set. To her jaw that spoke of determination, he brought over a gentle mare named Bess. She's steady, Jacob promised, holding the stirrup for her. She won't give you any trouble. Clara mounted with a grace that surprised him, settling into the saddle as if she belonged there. It feels high, she laughed nervously, adjusting her grip on the reins. Just follow my lead, Jacob said, swinging onto his own horse. They rode. Out of the ranch yard, side by side, the rhythmic thud of hooves filling the air. As they left the safety of the buildings behind and entered the open expanse of the prairie, Jacob watched her. Her head was up, her eyes scanning the horizon. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was riding into the light. Asterisk. The ride took them deeper into the heart of the territory, where the grass turned from green to a brittle sun-bleached brown. The drought had been unforgiving this year, leaving the earth cracked and thirsty. Yet, as they rode, the sheer scale of the landscape seemed to offer a strange kind of peace. It was a place too big for petty worries, a place that demanded respect. It's incredible, Clara said, her voice carrying over the sound of the wind. She looked around, eyes wide. It's so empty, it almost aches, but it's beautiful. Jacob nodded, his gaze scanning the horizon. It's honest. That's what I've always liked about it. This land doesn't pretend to be anything it isn't. It'll take everything you have if you let it, but what it gives back, that's yours. You earn every inch of it. They eventually reached a creek bed that had been reduced to a mere trickle of muddy water. Jacob pulled his horse up and dismounted, crouching down to inspect the flow. It wasn't good. The mud was thick, the water level dangerously low for this time of year. If we don't get rain soon, he muttered, half to himself, we're going to have to start digging new wells. Deeper ones. Clara slid down from her saddle and knelt beside him, not minding the dust on her skirt. She watched the sluggish water for a moment before speaking. In Kansas, before the fire, Robert was researching windmills. He wrote a series of articles about new designs that could draw water from aquifers much deeper than a standard well. Jacob looked at her, eyebrows raised in surprise. You read his technical papers? A small, proud smile touched her lips. I edited them, she corrected gently. Robert had big ideas, but his spelling was atrocious. I fixed his copy, handled the layout, and even ran the printing press when he fell ill. I know how those machines work. Jacob stared at her. He had expected. A woman who knew needlepoint and poetry, not mechanics and irrigation. You never cease to surprise me, Clara. You'd make a fine ranch foreman. She laughed, a genuine light sound that seemed to startle even her. That might be the strangest compliment a woman has ever received, Mr. Harlo. It's the highest one I can give, he replied earnestly. They stood there for a moment, the silence between them comfortable and warm. The awkwardness of their arrangement, the shadow of the bet, it all seemed miles away. "You've brought life back to the house, Clara," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "And not just the house. You've brought it back to me." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, with her mismatched eyes, one scarred, one clear. "And you," she whispered, "have given me a reason to stop hiding." Before Jacob could respond, the heavy rhythmic thud of galloping horses broke the yell. Moment. The sound rolled over the hills like thunder. Jacob's instinct kicked in instantly. He stood up and moved closer to Clara, his hand drifting toward his hip. 5 riders crested the nearby ridge, whooping and laughing. As they drew closer, Jacob's expression darkened. He recognized the lead rider immediately, Ned Bartlett. Ned ran a smaller outfit nearby, a man known for his cruelty to horses and his loud mouth in the saloon. The group slowed to a trot as they approached the creek bed, circling Jacob and Clara like vultures. "Well, well," Ned called out, pulling his horse up and leaning over the saddle horn with a sneer. "If it ain't the King of Wyoming, Jacob Harlo. And look at this. He's got his burned beauty out for a stroll." The men behind him snickered. The sound sharp and ugly. Clara froze, her hands gripping her reins so tightly her knuckles turned white. She lowered her head instinctively, trying to turn her scarred cheek away from them. "You ought to keep that veil on, lady," Ned continued, his voice dripping with mock concern. "The sun is mean on damaged goods. Scares the horses, too." "Ned," Jacob said. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. His voice was cold, flat, and hard as iron. "Choose your next words very carefully." The laughter in the group died instantly. Ned's smirk faltered as he looked into Jacob's eyes. There was a promise of violence there, a quiet rage that was far more terrifying than any shout. "You forget yourself, Bartlett." Jacob stepped forward, placing himself physically between the riders. "And Clara, you are on my land, and you are insulting my guest." One of the younger riders looked nervous, nudging Ned's arm. "Let's go, boss. It ain't worth it." Ned chewed on his lip, measuring his chances. He spat into the dust near Jacob's boots. A final act of petty defiance, but he pulled his reins to turn the horse around. "Sure, Harlo. Just passing through. No offense meant." "Get moving," Jacob ordered. The group kicked their horses into a gallop and rode off, their dusty wake settling over the creek bed. Their laughter trailed behind them, faint but stinging. Clara let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging. The light that had been in her eyes just moments ago was gone, replaced by shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered, staring at the ground. Jacob turned to her, frowning. "Sorry for what?" "For bringing this to your door," she said, her voice trembling. "For the embarrassment. You shouldn't have to defend someone like me." Jacob grabbed the reins of his horse, his jaw set. "Clara, look at me." When she finally raised her eyes, he spoke with fierce conviction. "That trouble isn't yours anymore. It's mine, and I handle my own trouble." The ride back to the main house was quiet, but the heavy, awkward silence from earlier in the day had evaporated. In its place was a shared understanding, a bond forged in the dust of the creek bed. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Wyoming sky in violent shades of purple and bruised orange, Jacob kept his horse close to hers. He didn't speak, but his presence was a shield, a silent promise that the insults of men like Ned Bartlett would never touch her again, not by the time they reached the ranch. Night had fully descended. The air turned crisp, carrying the scent of cooling earth and distant sage. Jacob helped Clara down from her horse. Her hands were steady now, the trembling fear from the town confrontation replaced by a quiet thoughtfulness. Later that evening, after the ranch had settled into slumber, Jacob found her standing on the front porch. She was leaning against the railing, wrapped in a shawl, looking up at the vast canopy of stars that only the frontier could offer. Jacob stepped out quietly, 2 mugs of steaming coffee in his hands. He held one out to her. "It's getting cold out here." Clara turned, a small, grateful smile touching her lips as she took the cup. "I don't mind. The sky. It's so much clearer here than it ever was back east. It makes you feel small. In a good way." Jacob leaned against the post next to her, sipping his black coffee. "You don't owe me anything, you know," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could check them. "For today. For standing up to Bartlett." Clara looked down into her dark cup. "Maybe not," she murmured, "but I feel the weight of it. You took a risk for me. You put your reputation on the line for a woman the whole town laughs at." "Let them laugh," Jacob grunted. "They're fools. They see a veil and a scar and think they know the whole story. I see ... something else." She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the starlight, reflecting the constellations above. "You are a good man, Jacob Harlo, even if you try very hard to convince the world otherwise." Jacob felt a lump form in his throat. He reached out his rough, calloused fingers brushing against her gloved hand on the railing. "And you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "are stronger than any person I have ever met, man or woman." For a heartbeat, she didn't pull away. She stared out at the horizon, where the black earth met the black sky. "I don't know if it's strength," she confessed softly. "Maybe strength is just what you have left when everything else has been burned away. You just keep standing because there is no other choice." He wanted to tell her she was wrong. He wanted to tell her that what she had was courage, the kind that soldiers prayed for. But before he could find the words, a streak of light slashed across the heavens. A shooting star, burning bright and fast, dying in a blaze of glory against the dark dot. Clara gasped softly, watching it fade. A strange, melancholic smile crossed her face. "Maybe that's a sign." "Of what?" Jacob asked. "That even after fire," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind, "something beautiful can still burn bright." Jacob's heart clenched in his chest. He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized he wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to tell her that the bet was the stupidest thing he'd ever done, but also the luckiest. He wanted to say that he didn't care about the scars, that when he looked at her, he didn't see the damage. He saw the woman who had made this empty, echoing house feel like a home for the first time in his life, but the words felt too big, too fragile for the night air. So he just nodded, letting the silence speak for him. The next morning broke with a brilliant golden light. When Jacob came downstairs, the house was already awake with the smells of breakfast. He found Maria in the kitchen, but she wasn't cooking. She was looking out the window toward the garden. "She is out there again," Maria said, a warm smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. "Look at her," said her. Jacob moved to the window. Clara was kneeling in the dirt, her hands deep in the soil, planting a new row of seeds. She wasn't wearing her veil. The morning sun caught the strands of her hair, the brown curls that were slowly, stubbornly growing back, soft against the healed skin of her scalp. She looked peaceful. "She is healing," Maria observed quietly. Jacob watched her for a long moment, feeling a sense of peace settle over him that he hadn't felt in years. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And so am I." Weeks turned into months, and the relentless grip of the drought finally began to loosen. It started with a low rumble of thunder in the west, a sound that the ranch hands paused their work to listen to, like it was a hymn. Then came the rain. It fell hard and fast, washing away the dust that had coated the double H for too long, turning the gray world back into vivid color. The change in the land mirrored the change within the house. The shadows that had clung to the corners of the rooms seemed to retreat, chased away by the presence of a woman who was learning how to breathe again. One crisp morning, Jacob stepped out onto the porch, a mug of coffee in hand, and stopped dead in his tracks. Along the fence line, where the earth had been dry and cracked just a season ago, there was a flash of vibrant crimson roses. They were wild, stubborn things, their petals unfolding against the rough wood of the fence. Clara had planted them weeks ago, tending to them with a quiet determination that the ranch hands had whispered was a waste of time. "Nothing pretty grows in this dirt," Tom Brennan had warned her kindly. But Clara had just smiled and kept watering them. Now they were blooming. Jacob walked down the steps, drawn to the splash of color. As he got closer, he heard a sound that stopped his heart for a second. Laughter. It wasn't the polite, guarded chuckle he had heard in the parlor. This was a full, bright sound, light and pure, carrying across the yard on the morning breeze. Clara was there, kneeling by the fence, showing something to Maria. She wasn't wearing her veil. She wasn't even wearing the wide-brimmed hat. The morning sun hit her face fully, illuminating both the smooth skin on the right and the jagged silvery scars on the left. She didn't turn away. She didn't hide. She was simply living. Jacob watched her, feeling a sudden, overwhelming wave of clarity. It hit him with the force of a physical blow. The bet, the wager that had started all of this. It had been the most shameful, arrogant moment of his life. He had stood on that porch in Redemption Creek, a man hollowed out by pride, thinking he could buy a woman's dignity for $300. It was a mistake that should have damned him. And yet, as he watched Clara laugh at something Maria said, brushing a stray lock of regrown hair from her forehead, Jacob realized it was also the best thing that had ever happened to him. He had gone looking for a way to prove his dominance to a town of fools. Instead, he had found something far greater. He had found a partner. He had found a woman who had lost everything: her family, her home, her very face, and yet had taught him what truly mattered. It wasn't about the size of the ranch or the fear you commanded in town. It wasn't about pride or power. It was about this. It was about the grace to plant roses in a drought. It was about the courage to let the world see her scars and refuse to be ashamed. Clara looked up and saw him watching. Her smile didn't fade. It softened, turning into something private and warm. She stood up, dusting the dirt from her hands, and walked over to him. "They bloomed," she said, gesturing to the flowers. "Tom owes me $1. Jacob chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "I wouldn't take that bet if I were him. I've learned the hard way that betting against you is a losing game." Clara's expression grew serious. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his forearm. "You didn't lose, Jacob." He looked down at her hand, then up into her mismatched eyes. "No," he agreed softly. "I didn't." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his thumb grazing the edge of the scar on her temple. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. In that moment, the ghost of the mystery widow was gone forever. It was only Clara. "You saved me," he whispered, the admission tearing itself from his throat. "I thought I was saving you, bringing you here. But this house, my life. It was dead before you walked through that door." Clara opened her eyes, and they were filled with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. "We saved each other," she said firmly. "That's how it works, I think. We pull each other out of the fire." Jacob pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against the Wyoming wind. The past was gone, the fire, the auction, the loneliness. All that remained was the future, stretching out before them like the open plains. "Let's go home," he said. "We are home," she replied. And as they walked back toward the house, Hand in hand, the wind swept across the land, carrying the scent of sage and the sweet, impossible fragrance of roses that had bloomed from the ashes.